Bad that everyone had to see all of that. That was really bad. Yikes. Yeah. That was a true troll. Okay, sorry, let's go back to the Hey Kazast. Sorry, was dealing with something. I shouldn't have done that. Now I realize that this was a bad idea. A bad idea to do this particular thing that I did. But I learned. Sorry that other people suffered from that troll. But anyway, okay. I teach rhetoric and public speaking mostly, and that's what we were talking about until this troll came in, and I had to spend like 5 minutes talking about that. So we're talking about rhetoric, and we're talking about this great argument of social media is responsible for the socially crippled and easily offendable youth that Viking overlord Gab3_Sanuwu put into the chat. And so, okay, here are a couple of things I think about it, which is, one is the first thing that I would say is, well, what's the language here, and who are we trying to appeal to? Because if you say a term that language has orientations in it, right? So if I say, oh, you socially crippled people, also, I mean, people probably might not like that language anyway. They might just kind of be like, ooh, don't like those words. But also kind of identifying people that way maybe makes an assumption, begs the question about, well, are those people socially crippled? So one of the things we want to do in making that argument to be like, well, here are the kinds of phenomena that I see that I think are what I'm talking about when I say that. So be kind of prepared to define that. We can talk about that, I think. Because one of the counter arguments you might face is to say, no, people aren't socially crippled today any more than they were in the past. This is a common argument, just that we see it more because it's now more visible. So this is a common moment in argument where argument changes, where we say, okay, it's not that something has become more common, it's just that our awareness of it has increased. And that before, when people were socially awkward or something like that, they wouldn't appear in public. So we wouldn't be on social media. You wouldn't see them at all because they would just stay at home. And now because people can stay at home and be online, we have a lot more evidence of it. So that's an argument that you should be prepared to kind of come into contact with, I think. But one thing you might say is like, okay, well, I mean this specific behavior, and here's why I think social media is responsible for it, for making people offendable, easily offendable. Because I think this is an interesting argument. We hear a lot about this in terms of like cancel culture, and there was that Harper's letter not so long ago, and the snowflake kind of stuff that we hear a lot in American political discourse. There's a generational argument there. There's a political argument about there. But this question about being offended, I find it to be really interesting, because one of the things that being too offended is an argument about emotions. And we tend to think that arguments about things are good and true if they involve our reason, and that emotions are separate from reason. But so many of our arguments are actually about emotions. Is this an acceptable thing to be angry at? Or are you wrong to be angry at it? Or have you misunderstood it? That those emotional responses that people have that cause people to differ in their judgments about things are related to different interpretations of the world. So they actually have a lot of room for controversy and reasoning. And so this question of, well, people shouldn't be offended at that. They'd be too easily offended. So I think here, this argument would definitely be improved if you had brought in some evidence of, here's what you think is people being too offended at something, but also a reason why. Why should people not be offended at things like this? And I sometimes see evidence where I also feel that way. I say, people are a little too kind of quick. One of the things that I see is they're a little too quick to be angry about the simple use of a term. Now, there's some terms that I think rightly create anger, but sometimes people are trying to find their way in a new discourse, trying to find their way in a language. They don't know the language of the locals. And people are a little bit too quick to say, okay, you didn't use the right term, it's kind of a shibboleth, so you're a bad person. And I think social media might contribute to that, because one of the things that happens when you're on social media is that because there's semi-anonymous people and quasi-anonymous people, you get the feeling that we are only going to test people on the basis of what they're actually putting forward on social media. So we don't know a lot about people other than what they're putting forward. So if someone's trying to learn and actively engage in how should I participate in a community, one that they might identify with partially or be interested in or have some reason to be in contact with, which might not be totally embracing all of the values at once, because it's just kind of coming to know what the values of that community are in social media. the people are a little bit too quick to kind of say, okay, well, that's how we identify you. So one thing I would say that could be very helpful to support this argument would be, well, what would be your alternative? And I would say we need to find a way to help people learn how to be in different groups of people, to learn what the norms and rules and regulations are to be there. And that obviously is because that's so complex. Every community, every organization of people is going to have a set of norms that are very complex in how they're used. That it's going to take time for people to learn them. And social media doesn't really provide that time. It's time and its temporality zooms past. It's in the feed, it's in the scroll, it's in what's being delivered up to you. People are kind of anonymous. You don't know how long someone's been here or what their motives are. And so there's this tendency to kind of push back and dig in. So anyway, I don't know what you think of that argument or if you're even still here. But that's kind of some thoughts about it. Anyone in the chat have other thoughts, you could put them in. Or you could bring up new arguments, and we'll try to make them stronger and show you ways that you can go out and strengthen the arguments. Oh, I still feel really bad that happened in the Discord. But anyway, what happens, happens. What are some other arguments that you've been thinking about? Or thoughts on that one? Yeah, I mean, I think the sense that people are too easily offended, we can keep talking about it. There's a lot to talk about there. If we want to keep talking about it, we can. Being too easily offended, I think we get sometimes the idea that rather than there being an alternative of how could we organize ourselves so we have like more sense of how people relate to things. I think there's also the sense that people just shouldn't be angry. People shouldn't be angry. Should be satisfied. But in the background of every emotion is some idea of what's that emotion responding to? And I think clarifying that in your arguments about emotion, about how people ought to be responding, online or in the world or wherever, is clarifying what you think that they're responding to. Because I think a lot of the times our arguments about that tend to be very weak because we don't know how to talk about what those emotions are about. We say, oh, millennials, they're so rude, or they're so fragile. Or we say, those boomers, they lack empathy. They lack empathy. The Zoomers, you might say, yeah, they're really empathetic, but they're quick to anger. People have these kinds of broad generalizations about different generations and their emotional response. I don't think it's based on nothing. But I don't know what kind of conversation we're having. If we really want to say, well, I think things ought to be different for having that kind of conversation. I think people should respond different, orient themselves differently. What do you think people are orienting themselves towards? So, yeah, my orientation might be displayed in my feeling, like anger. But what do you think I'm angry at? If you think I'm not angry at the right thing, what should I be angry at? Might be a better argument than telling me not to be angry. As if there's only one thing in the world to respond to. You should be less angry. Or you should be happier. Happy about what? What would you like me to focus on? Or you shouldn't be happy. Look at all the terrible things going on in the world. Tell me how it concerns me or what it would mean for me to be invested in that thing that you want me to respond to. In classical rhetoric, one of the ideas is stasis, which is what we're arguing about, what's kind of in contention. So this is a helpful idea, I think. And there's lots of different ideas about how this can be adapted to different kinds of arguments and controversies. It did have a pretty legal character to it when they were first thinking about it, though law was practiced quite differently than it is really anywhere today in the world. There are relationships to it, of course, but it's pretty different. So the different points of stasis, they had different versions of it, but in the classical one, it's something like there are 4 points. The first one is we're arguing about the facts. What happened? Did you punch me or didn't you? And those kinds of controversies have their own kinds of rules and norms. But often that's not really what we're arguing about. More often than not, we're arguing about the next one, which is really characterizing the act. We're like, well, did you do something offensive or not? That kind of argument. That's an argument that's about definition. Not definition in the sense of, well, let me look up Merriam-Webster's dictionary and see what offensive means. This is a weird thing that people have done lately. I don't mean like lately like in the couple months. I mean lately in history, which is they defer to the authority of a term to the dictionary. This is a really bizarre thing to do, especially if you know how dictionaries are composed, because dictionaries take their authority from, yes, the serious research that lexicographers do. They're people who are make dictionaries and they study the words in that sense, and the histories of words sometimes, etymologies, those kinds of things. Lexicographers always, they have lots of different principles. They always follow language use. So the use of a language is where it gets its authority from. So it would be weird as a user of a language to defer all of your authority to the people doing the kind of Cliff's Notes on language usage. There's a lot of texture and material in language about how it's used, the appropriate moments to apply one word rather than another. And there's a lot to be argued about there. It's not that a language community doesn't settle all of those questions. A lot of those questions are active. Should we call this a constitutional crisis? Should we call this a coup? Those kinds of questions are political questions even though they're questions of definition. So we have arguments about what happened, where in fact there has to be a lot of agreement about the meaning of the terms for us to even have that kind of argument about what happened, what really happened. The second one's an argument about definition. What does a term mean? Does this term apply to this thing that we're talking about? Is that the best way of understanding it? The next one is, sure. I offended you. But being offended is good. Everyone needs to be a little bit more offended. And this is an argument, sometimes it's called an argument about quality, about whether something's good or bad. How should we value the thing? We'll say, I'll accept your terms. I'll call it what you want, and I'll say that I did it. But I'm not going to say that it's bad. That's a lot of argument is about that. And that's something that's not established by facts either, obviously. And the final one, the final kind of point of stasis of argument that we commonly arrive at is like an argument. It's in the legal form, it's an argument about jurisdiction almost. But really, I would say it's we can think about it as arguments about manner, about how we're arguing, or about the kind of nature of the argument itself. This might be something like, sure, fine, you're making good points, but why are you being such a jerk about it? Or it might be something like, okay, but are you the person that should really be saying this? Are you mansplaining something? Any of those arguments kind of about argument fall in that fourth category. So when we're thinking about that argument of people being very sensitive online being caused by social media, we could think about that as an argument from all those four different points of view. Which is to say, okay, well, let's say that someone's going to disagree with us on the facts. Say, no, I disagree with you. People have not become more sensitive. Or maybe they say, sure, people have become more sensitive, but it's not because they are on social media. So there's actually two different factual claims in that argument, and they could argue either one. So you'd have to kind of think about, how would I support either part of those? How would I support either of those claims? What kind of evidence would make it seem like people have become very sensitive online? Well, you might have that evidence in abundance, but be careful what you choose. If you choose something that's kind of not easily classifiable, people will say, I don't know if that's the right characterization. And we kind of slide down to argument number 2 about definition, but we're on that argument about your evidence. We tend to want our evidence to really be the kind of argument that our claim is trying to have. So if we have a claim that's about the facts, we don't want our evidence to be confused into another argument about definition. What kind of evidence you would choose would be really important, I think, especially for that first kind of claim. Well, we might say, okay, sure, you want to talk about people being more sensitive online, more offendable because of social media. I agree with you, but I just don't agree with that characterization. I think I agree with what you're seeing, and I think it's a real thing that's happening. I just don't think that what's happening is people are becoming too offended. The way I would characterize it, I'm imitating a potential opponent here to this claim. The way I'm characterizing it is that maybe somebody would just be aware of more. They kind of have more responsibility. They see themselves as responsible for more discourse, where a lot of people have tended before social media to shrug stuff off. Now people are prepared to argue and to defend arguments made by other strangers or argue against strangers. Isn't that what democracy looks like? So people might want to characterize it. And then we have the argument about quality. And there, that because definitions and terms often have orientations embedded in them, that was already an argument about quality. Is this a good or a bad thing? So yeah, sure, people are offended more online, but they should be more offended. There's lots of offensive things out there. Or that argument could be one about manner, being like, I mentioned this at the beginning. And what the claim was first stated as social media is responsible for socially crippled and easily offendable youth. And say, okay, well, why do you have to say socially crippled? Can't you say it in a nicer way? Maybe that's the kind of argument you end up in. Sometimes those arguments can be interesting. Sometimes they can be the kinds of things that frustrate people, where people are like, I want to talk about the meat of the argument. But you can't ignore it. It's a potential avenue of argument, is that they can argue about the argument itself. People are going to want to have it a different way. So anyway, I think that we dealt pretty solidly with that without any kind of further feedback from Viking Overlord. What other arguments do you have that you want to talk about? Yeah, I'm still feeling weird about the Discord thing. I'm realizing that what I did the first time was I banned him, personally, which is frustrating that they let me do that first. And then I couldn't see that he was continuing. So, sorry about that. I'm trying to think of some examples of this argument that I've come across recently where I was like, I've heard people both make the argument and found evidence for it, but people arguing against it. This happens on Twitter every day. This argument is called every day on Twitter, every single day. I'm going to go on Twitter right now and just see if anything pops up that might. This is probably what I should do, which is just when I'm waiting, just read out arguments from Twitter and see how I can make them better. So that's what I'm going to do. So this is just the first one that's at the top that I'm looking at. A big problem that we need to grapple with in social justice spaces is how Tumblr taught a huge group of people to appropriate... this is actually very relevant to what we were just talking about. Tumblr taught a huge group of people to appropriate social justice terminology and deploy it in order to destroy things that make them uncomfortable, rather than are actually oppressive. So yeah, maybe I can put that argument in the chat. Can I? Let's see. Can I do that? Yeah, I think I can. So here's one that I'll talk about. And that way you can read it too, in case you come in later. So this is an interesting one. And it is kind of related. And it literally was just the first thing there on Twitter that when I opened up the app. This kind of argument's happening all the time. So, and it's funny, it's about social media, but they specify, it's almost strikingly similar to the other argument, isn't it? They're talking about social media. They're saying Tumblr is responsible, but specifically Tumblr. So it's safe to use Twitter, I guess, because does it happen on Twitter? Not sure about that. So it's on Tumblr, and they're saying it taught a huge group of people to appropriate social justice terminology, which is an interesting phrase itself. What is social justice terminology? What is social justice? I think we all might have a sense of that, but that might be a place where I'd say, if I really needed to be prepared to make this argument better, I might be sensitive to the kinds of definitional challenges that could come there, or the questions that could come around that phrase, and deploy it in order to destroy things that make them uncomfortable rather than are actually oppressive. And that's the meat of the argument, which is that people's motivations are wrong. People's motivations are coming from personal discomfort rather than kind of whatever would be the ideal here, probably something like solidarity. So social justice terminology is being used against the ends of social justice. I'm expanding it a little bit. But yeah, I think something like that. Curious what you think about that kind of an argument. I think there's something interesting in it. I wonder if one of the things that occurs to me is that in thinking about a social justice space, that the kind of limitation on that to say, okay, this is a social justice space. No, that's not what people mean. They just kind of mean, sometimes people are in activist communities, they'll say like, oh, this is one of those spaces where we kind of gather, whether it's an activist group or a kind of party meeting or something like that. So that's really what they mean. But in order to even have that, there is that kind of sense of like, well, you got to learn our ways that we were talking about before. How do you come into that group? And one of the things that people can do when they come into a group to establish themselves as in members is to point to other people as out members. This is a pretty basic dynamic, right? I want to be accepted as being in the group, so I start accusing other people of not being loyal to the group or not having the correct amount of solidarity with the mission of the group or something like that. So you can kind of use, this is the idea of turning the ideals of a group against itself. And this does happen, I do think. I think that's a fair description of what happens in lots of different kinds of organizations, even ones organized around justice, maybe especially so. Maybe there's a special reason why it happens with justice, because you have that sense of moral high ground or moral righteousness. And so that if you're able to kind of claim that against others, it makes it very difficult for someone to find an alternative terminology to speak from. So everyone begins kind of speaking in the same terms because they seem to express the values of the group, though the applications of those terms seem to destroy the solidarity of the group. Big problem. One thing that it kind of reminds me of is in studying the English Civil War in the 17th century, in which there was a large Puritan faction. And the Puritans, you might know, they get kind of a bad rap. They're kind of interesting, people who were the Puritans. They're not all like the ones that came to America. But they definitely tended towards a kind of rhetoric that was suspicious of people not being kind of pure enough. That's where they're getting their name from, is their opponents are like, oh yeah, a bunch of Puritans over there. That even small kinds of gestures of piety might be looked at as idolatry. And this happened in the French Wars of Religion too, where I read an essay by Montaigne where one guy who wanted to disguise himself, he was trying to escape from a place that was ruled by the Catholics, and he was a French Protestant, and he wore a cross as a way of trying to make it look like he wasn't Protestant, because Protestants would never have worn crosses in this period. And that's was his disguise, right? So these little tiny things would identify people. In fact, that was so intense a little bit later on that it affected the English language profoundly. The Quakers would use thou. So you know how in lots of languages there's the you and the tu form, or the vous and the tu form, like in French, vos and tu. Lots of Romance languages have a formal you and an informal you, and sometimes it doubles as a plural you. English only has the plural second person for all of its usages, which is weird. We don't think about you as the plural or the formal one because we use it all the time. What was the informal you? Well, to us it sounds very formal just because it's old. Thou. Thou was, and thine, all of those words were like, that's the impersonal too. The reason why, or it's suspected why, the reason why it went out of use is because Quakers, who were committed to radical equality, would refer even to heads of states and to people of high station as thou. Kind of, and the Quakers got beat up a lot for doing stuff like that, and people didn't want to seem like they were Quakers, so people overcorrected. Everyone else overcorrected and started referring only with the formal you, and so then thou fell out of use. Very interesting story to show how linguistic norms can't really be separated from social norms and even political norms of how we organize ourselves. If we refer to everyone as the informal you, we're suggesting something about the equality and solidarity of everyone in society. But that might butt up against some of the realities of social hierarchy. And should we respect those or not can become a big question. Should you refer to this is another thing that was on Twitter not long ago where someone was like, you should always call your professor, which I found very funny. I'm going to turn the light on a little bit here. Because a lot of people find those kinds of things to be very important. I've never found them to be very important in either direction. When I've had titles, I've never wanted them to be used or anything like that. But also, I've never been inclined to use titles towards other people though I have, usually out of sense of fear, not out of a sense of like, oh wow, I really admire this person's title or something like that. So, but I had to use those a lot where I grew up because there's a lot of people with titles, mostly father and sister, because I was in a Catholic community. So those titles had to be respected to show the authority. So should we respect those kinds of social images of authority that appear in our language or not? This is one of the things that people are talking about in that broader sense. But in the social justice space, the social justice terminology, people want to think that this is something that people are learning online. I do think people are learning a lot about how to use language online, but I think it's very clear to me that it's also a place where people are constantly confused because you're butting up against other forms of language that you couldn't have encountered in your real life. This is something that also happens in hip-hop communities, right? Because we have rappers from all over the world now, but even in earlier just American hip-hop from East Coast or West Coast. But really, you can listen to hip-hop from anywhere in the world, and people are going to be speaking in local dialects, local slang. And those words are going to get introduced, and you're like, wait a minute, what was that? What was a glitzy? What was a glitzy? I don't know. And then you have to go to Urban Dictionary, right? Now, at the level of just kind of not knowing and knowing, that sense of belonging or not belonging, it seems like it's very neutral. Oh, now I know. Now I know how to use it. Wait a minute. Are you sure? Are you sure it's so neutral? Even when the word means something kind of banal. Oh, John just means thing in Philly. Even when it doesn't have any special meaning that connotes your orientation to the world, your sense of being able to use that word is an argument or a claim about belonging to the group, being an authentic member or representative of it, or as a sign that that usage no longer connotes that. Okay, people from outside of the DC area are saying glitzy now. People from outside of Philly are saying John. So that's no longer our term, and our language needs to change to show and represent and index where we're from. A lot of that stuff that's argument about argument, I think, is argument about language, and about language not in the sense of some universal image of language, which is what dictionaries, at least what people imagine dictionaries to represent. Here's the universal image of what a word means. This is the kind of final authority. But language itself indexes lots of special relationships that people have to their life, to their community, towards their gender, and all these kinds of things. Constantly, every time throughout our day, we're indexing relationships. Whether I say here or there even, represents some kind of, indexes some vague sense of is something proximate to me or distant from me. I can say that here or there, they can both be correct, but it kind of shows you my orientation towards something. Oh, give it here. Give it there. See the difference? Right? It depends on the context of what that really indexes, what meaning. And it can be quite unclear, even to the person using it, exactly what it means. They might not be able to explain to you why they use one word rather than another. But all those kinds of things are in there. When people come to social justice language, where there's a lot of moral investment, you might even think of a kind of spiritual investment in the correct use of certain terms, or in a use of terms that's sensitive to lots of distinct problems or identities that people might have. One of the reasons why that becomes such a kind of proving ground for people, where they learn a lot of things, is because a lot of times when people join a group initially, they don't. It's not the values of the group that they are most attracted to. They might be more attracted to the values of the group over that other group that excludes them, but they just kind of want to belong. So any strategy of belonging you're going to see when people begin to adopt a new terminology. They'll try to quickly metabolize a terminology and try to use it to the best of their ability in a way the community would deem appropriate. So I think one of the things that Tumblr did is it spawned lots of tiny little communities that made themselves distinct from others by developing a terminology that became more and more specific to the people that were identifying with it. And that these then became attached to an idea of a universal discourse in which all of the identities were represented. And I think this is where some of the paradoxes about maybe internet, what people associate with the social justice warrior and their kinds of language and their difficulties with it, it is, I think, an effect of social media in part. because it's a combination of two language ideologies. One is one that everyone kind of seems to share. I don't. But it's the idea of language as dictionary. And that there's a universal image of language where the truth of things is represented, the true meanings are represented. Rather than recognizing that just like the light of the moon from the sun, the dictionary only reflects the authority of a language community. It can only ever do that. And it's always partial in how it represents it, and it has its own way of structuring it, which is going to be at odds with the living language of a community by the very fact that it's written down. And most of language use is going to be, not most of it, but much of language use, let's say, is not going to be in written form. Or if it's in written form, it's not going to be in that printed form. So all of those things are at play all the time. So, but the desire also for people to have identities or terminologies that would help best represent them, say, okay, well, I don't feel, when people call me a certain identity, they say, okay, you're asexual. Or they say, are you gay? And I say, no, I feel like I'm asexual, but actually I do feel sexual desire at certain moments, but only in these very specific relationships with people that I'm already friends with. And becoming more and more specified about how they feel and things, for me, on the one hand, I'd say that's great. That's what I'm trying to get students to do a lot, is to get really precise with their language, to be able to describe it with more specificity, how they feel about things. What's interesting sociologically about that language practice, where there was a lot of practice in lots of communities to make a language more precise, is that how that process was represented to people in the community and to themselves, how they represented it to themselves, was discovering identity. And then there's this other weird thing, which is that even though we're talking about fluidity in a lot of these communities, the sense of identity is that it's composite, but unified. And maybe it changes in time, but at any one moment, it has some kind of reality to it. And I think letting go of that idea of identity as being a kind of truth and seeing identity more as an identification would give you a lot more possibilities. Be like, yeah, I tend more here than there. But because that idea of language as dictionary is operating in the background of a very precise language community that has moral investments in being able to precisely respect and clarify people's sexual and gender identities, maybe above all, we get this kind of strange brew when that hits back into a broader discourse where people have not been participating in that very precise language specification, but still also have that idea of language as dictionary. So as someone who wasn't in those communities, but operating without the language as dictionary philosophy, to me the solution to this, on a personal level, is just kind of to see all of these usages as moments in which I'm learning a local language. And whenever I would go somewhere, if I was going to go take a trip somewhere, people were speaking another language, I think most of us, even if we wouldn't do it, we would recognize that the better thing would be to try to learn the local language to communicate with people, but also not try to learn the local language as a tourist and have so much confidence that I think that I could speak it like a local. Like, probably everyone can still tell I'm a tourist. So allowing myself to kind of be a tourist in another language and not presenting myself as something else, to me seems to be like a good ethic in online spaces. Doesn't mean there can't be misunderstanding. One of the reasons why I think it doesn't happen that way is everyone feels like everyone's coming to them. You came to my Facebook. This is my Tumblr page. So you don't ever feel like a tourist when you encounter other language. You feel like other people are coming to you. And everyone has this response to language, the immigration of other people into their language, whatever their views on immigration are, which is stay out. My language is true. Why do they have that? Because the language as dictionary philosophy is operating. And when you're introducing these innovative terms, you're trying to introduce new things into reality that I don't think are real. And then we have this kind of big impasse, when really it wasn't that kind of a problem. At first, it was like, oh, your language operates with different norms and rules, so we have to kind of find a way to understand each other. First, I have to understand what you mean, or why are you so... I mean, even this wouldn't be so strange, right? If you go to a foreign country and you do something and everyone reacts with horror, you wouldn't be like, these people are all wrong. you would be like, what did I do? I have to learn what I did so I don't do it again here. Now, you might come to understand the culture's view of why, touching, maybe it's some strange kind of gesture that you did. You're like, okay, I didn't know that touching my hands in this way was really offensive here. But you might come to learn why they think that and be like, actually, that's true. I just never thought about it before. That's always kind of happening. And maybe you adopt that culture and you bring it back to your own. Maybe you even tell other people about it and it spreads. This, I think, is a very, very typical and normal ways that culture is spread and people learn it. And it's one of the least violent ways that cultures can spread, which is basically people who are casually acquainted with a culture come to understand it better and orienting themselves towards it, want to adopt it. So I'd say if you're on the other end and you're like, I feel like other people are not understanding or taking me seriously enough, they're not respecting my identity because of how I speak, be like, they might not be. They might not be. But think about it this way, like they don't understand your culture. You might really even think about it that way. They kind of come from a different culture. And so give them the kind of hospitality that you would a kind of guest from a less hospitable land. And try to still treat them with hospitality and be like, oh, okay. And you might, you don't want to patronize them and be like, oh, you can't understand anything. You can't understand anything here because you don't know the language. They might be hostile to your culture. You can be a hostile tourist, but they're still a tourist. So they don't even know what they're being hostile towards. Probably they don't understand the full effect of what they're doing. But you might need to communicate that to them in a language different from the one that they violated. Anyway, I didn't think that this is what I'd be talking about tonight, but it's very interesting, helping me think a little bit about it. If you have any other ideas, please drop them in. Other arguments. This is a argument doctor stream. It's a new format, though I've thought about it for a while, where you bring arguments and I'll try to help you make them better. So far, that's mostly me talking, but one other thing we can do is you can post in here, like, this is a claim that I see a lot, it's an argument I'd like to make, and I don't know how to make it, or I keep doing it this way and people don't like it, or they get angry at me. And we can talk about it, and I'll ask you some questions about where it comes up in your life and that kind of a thing. Oh, man. Okay, I'm going to go back to Twitter and get another argument then. Let's see what else comes up. What's on like the main page? I don't even remember how to get to that. You just go to like the very basic thing that everybody sees. Yeah, I'm also thinking about putting music in the background. And I know they'll probably take that out for YouTube, but I don't really care. I'm not trying to make money or anything on this. So if anybody has any ideas about how to best do that, how to put music behind the Twitch stream, let me know. I use OBS as my software, but I don't want to just like turn it on in the background. I think that would probably give you pretty bad audio quality. Twitter.com. It's what's happening. Is it? Is it what's happening? Okay. Maybe I'll do it here where I'm not logged in. Bring me your arguments. edit out that troll from the beginning of this video if I want to post it, and that's another annoying thing. Anyway, doesn't really matter. Oh, is that the one? That's the Explorer one. Okay. All right. What's trending? Antifa. Lots of videos of people dancing. I also wonder whether I should switch from just chatting to politics for this stream. It doesn't have to be political, but I just wonder if there are more people there who are looking for this kind of stuff, where it could be useful to them to have better arguments. All right, let's see. Medicare. I have a theory as to why trolls, what trolls are after. And there's some research that was done a long time ago, but I think it's still relevant, that what really people enjoy, or what brings them enjoyment, is not so much like the ideas that we have about what brings people pleasure or that kind of thing, but feeling like they have an effect on the world, that they've caused something. And trolling is very clear that you do. You have an effect. Not necessarily a good one, but... Okay, here's another one. Critical race theory was one of the many academic frameworks for thinking about socioeconomic inequalities, one that many leftists rejected, and it has been elevated to the left framework because conservatives got mad about that hack Robin DiAngelo. Politics by antagonism rock. I think the last bit's ironic, but I'll put that one in there too. I think this one also has a kind of common theme with a lot of arguments that we see. There are a couple things there, but we see in all of these arguments so far, the one that we got from chat, from our Viking, and from these two tweets that I'm putting in, is that there are arguments about causality, what causes things. One recommendation I would have to make an argument like this stronger is see if you could make the argument without making a causal claim. Because causal claims are very hard to argue for, or not hard to argue for. They're hard to prove in the way that many people who want the support of a causal claim would like it to be proved. So I don't think we can kind of change the language here pretty easily to say, okay, so critical race theory gets taken up by the American conservative class as the left framework, and they're saying because conservatives got mad about that hack Robin DiAngelo, and think that's the author of White Fragility. And so this is an argument about, in some sense, you could say it's an argument about the facts, about this is the reason why critical race theory has become so popular. Is this a good explanation, a good causal explanation? We could see that in that first category of the stasis points we were talking about before, of facts, or the conjecture about what things have occurred. It's also an argument about why things have occurred. You could also put in there. But the next one, definition. How should we characterize something? They can kind of participate in both. And I think often it's better to go for that characterizing argument because you often have the same kind of rhetorical effect on your audience if they accept it. And you can prove it more easily, or you can kind of prove it with the kinds of evidence that are more available to us, more readily available to us. So I'd say that would be good. So here's how you might do that. And to say, we can see, when this was deployed, when this framework of critical race theory was deployed in popular books and got wide reception, as in the book by Robin DiAngelo of White Fragility. We saw what reaction it had there. That's the kind of reaction that people want to create. And so it's obvious that, it's a good one to go with. So I kind of imply a causal claim, but I never really make it. Instead, I just say that would make sense if I were from the viewpoint of someone trying to create a name or characterize a discourse that would produce a strong reaction. We just look to see what did produce that reaction. And this book, White Fragility, is one of those things. And so we adopt a language out of it. I haven't read that book, so I don't know if it uses critical race theory or not. That would certainly affect any of these claims. So yeah, other arguments that you have. That was such a good first one. I wish that person kept talking. It didn't go away. But I was all thrown off by the troll, so I was a little nervous. But I'm over it now. What else can I say about this one? I don't really. This one isn't as interesting as the other two. I think the other thing that's interesting here in the characterizing argument that's happening is this tweet says that critical race theory is an academic framework for thinking about socioeconomic inequalities. And I don't know everything about critical race theory, but I would say that's a pretty tendentious characterization itself. And one thing we'll see a lot of times in arguments is that a kind of establishing claim being like, okay, this is just the thing that we all have to accept in order to get to my real claim. And that's the second part here of why it's been elevated. But that first part of the claim, I think, maybe also requires a little bit more support. Or we could ask that from it. Say, well, why are you characterizing it that way? This is one of those definitional arguments. Is this a good way of thinking about socioeconomic inequalities? Maybe not. Is that what critical race theory sets out to do? To talk about socioeconomic inequalities? Doesn't it set out to talk about racial inequality, specifically before the law? And so if you say, yeah, but really those are socioeconomic inequalities, that actually shows a pretty clear viewpoint that you have, a kind of orientation that you have, which is to say the ultimate problems all reduce down to socioeconomic inequality. So any discourse that's talking about a problem in some other way is really is a discourse about socioeconomic inequality, something like that. Because I think that's kind of a surprising characterization, to be honest. You might also make the same claim and say it's because it doesn't talk about socioeconomic inequality, which is why it's been elevated. I don't know. What kind of arguments are you getting in? How would you like to get out of them? Or, if you can't get out of your arguments, can you at least make them better? Well, bring the arguments here. Put them in chat. We'll talk a little bit about them. We'll try to make them stronger. This is a argument doctor stream. First one I've ever done. I've done stuff like this before in my life. Trying it on Twitch. Give me an argument. We'll try to make it better. It doesn't have to be an argument you believe. I think it could be interesting practice just to think about arguments. You might say, well, what would the strongest version of this argument look like from my opponent? How can I better prepare against it? Or maybe we don't need to think about every argument as antagonistic and say, well, what would this argument look like in a conversation with somebody who's skeptical about something that I really hold dear or I believe in? Well, there's lots of ways it can come up. Bring me your arguments. So far we've been talking mostly about social media because that was the first argument that was posted, and then I threw in a few other examples from Twitter that I found that were really just the first ones that came up. But the first one, it seems like a lot of discourse is happening around social media and sensitivity and these kinds of arguments and its effect on our lives. So if you have other arguments about that too, that's great because we're already talking about that. I've been thinking about it for a while. One thing that crossed my mind the other day is I remember back in 2011, I guess. I especially remember this during where people were calling the Arab Spring at the time. Where people were like, there's this big argument of, oh, these revolutions are fueled by Facebook. Tahrir Square, it's the Facebook revolution. And then a counter argument that was probably that was even louder of being like, no, this has nothing to do with Facebook. These people are overstating the claim. Media is kind of sensationalizing the effects of social media. To the point that I remember from that argument, some people were going pretty far with it and saying, no, really, social media doesn't have any effect on us. Social media is not real life. Twitter's not real life. And there's still a kind of fledgling version of that argument that's out there that people kind of sometimes try to make. Usually they do it in a dismissive way. But dismissals are argumentative. Even if they're not full arguments, they're not maybe supported as much as we would hope from an argument. But when people say something like Twitter is not real life, or go touch grass, or Facebook is a brain disease, or whatever people are saying about social media, or be like, oh, I'm addicted to TikTok. I wish I could do something real, as if TikTok's not part of their reality. Whatever it may be, whatever form it may take. I think this is another big kind of attitude worth reflecting on in arguments about social media, which is, are we beginning from the attitude that social media is not real or has no value, or the only kind of value it has been expressed? That the social media that we got is the truth of social media. Could different platforms create different kinds of discourse? One thing I would say to that is I think we often really do assume that. People have these kinds of stereotypes about different social media users, TikTok, Reddit, 4chan, where people go online. Not only does it create different affinities where different kinds of people are drawn to them, it creates different people. I'm hearing the term social media less and less. Folks just talk about the thing they are on. Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder if that will become a kind of trend. Oh, hey, what's up, Alan? I wonder if that will become a kind of trend where people will just be like, oh, this is what happened today on TikTok. And they don't kind of think about it as being in an ecosystem with other parts of social media. One thing that makes me feel like we're not totally there yet is it's very easy to share and move things across different social media platforms. And a lot of times, a lot of the discourse on very popular parts of social media, whether it's Reddit's front page or Facebook or Twitter, people are like, oh, this is just a stolen meme from Twitter, or this is just a stolen meme from 4chan. Or this is just stolen from somewhere else. And saying, oh, we were so much better before we got the Tumblr kids in here, or whatever it is. But people are kind of quite conscious and talk about and identify certain kinds of discourse that are happening on social media with other places, usually in a negative light. Like, I wish those people would stay away from my little corner of the universe. But maybe we're going that direction. I don't know, because I don't do a lot of these things, especially Instagram and TikTok. I don't know much about them at all. Yeah. But yeah, any arguments you have that you would want to bring? We got off to a kind of rocky start here because we had like a troll. But TikTok is art these days. Well, that's an argument. TikTok is art, yeah. There's so many, really anything can go on there. But it does seem to nevertheless create a kind of genre, doesn't it? I took a film class once. And I took Film Theory 2 without taking Film Theory 1. But it didn't end up mattering because it was just like, different set of ideas. And I'm talking with the professor at one point, and she was talking a lot about the short form. She was even thinking about like the GIF. It's like a looping video going around. And she was like, yeah, this is, we film, if you think about that as a kind of cinema, I'd never thought about GIFs as cinema. She's like, well, think about it as that part of that tradition. And I'll be like, we're kind of returning to early cinema, where there were lots of, even before movie cameras, where there are these not kaleidoscopes, what do they call these? Rotoscopes, various different kinds of optical illusions that would just spin around. Very short sequences of film. She's like, that's what we've come back to with all of our technology. And that was a great definitional argument. It didn't really do much in terms of put forward a strong claim. It just made me see something in a different light. It was saying, look, take this phenomenon and put it in connection with another one by thinking about GIFs as kind of part of the tradition of cinema. Yeah, I've heard recently stuff about TikTok's algorithm and how the algorithm is maybe more sophisticated than some of the other algorithms. Oh yeah, you cut your own GIFs? Nice. Oh, you're always doing cool stuff. Oh yeah, I remember when you were posting a lot of these before. Yeah, you're really good at it. So I mean, I think in a certain sense, you're doing like every time you select out a... Yeah, exactly. It's an art, though. Editing and cropping is an art. And that was another argument in early film, which is sometimes it's kind of given to these two avatars of film. The French theorist Bazin and Eisenstein of Soviet cinema. And Bazin was like, the essence of film is photography. It's the reality, the documentary effect of light coming onto the film and producing a chemical reaction that really happens. And that even, a film that's fictive, like, you need that real thing to be there. Sorry, my nose is so itchy. I can feel that the pollen is higher today than yesterday. But anyway, whereas Eisenstein was like, no, the essence of film, and I think Eisenstein wins this argument, I have to say, especially since we're like way past the photographic film moment, but still have a lot of cinema being produced in the digital era. The essence of cinema is montage, meaning editing. It's the moment of cutting. Like, that's where the art of it really is. If you put on a surveillance video for 24 hours and you looked at the tape, you wouldn't be like, what a great movie. First of all, it'd be very boring. But you'd be like, well, if we edited it up, maybe. But we'd have to cut it up. That's where a lot of the art comes from, Yeah, but this is, again, if you have any arguments that you've been having or that you want to have, drop them in. We can talk about them and maybe make them better. Maybe make your life a little easier. Or more interesting or more difficult. I don't know. Depends on what kind of arguments you want to be in. Go into the idea that if you take away any part of it, it's not the same thing. In terms of an edited film or edited piece of media, yeah. Editing in camera would be a thing. Oh, that would be nice. I'm sure that there's something like that kind of exists, maybe, but I think that's kind of what people are using. One of the reasons why I think TikTok and those kinds of apps become so successful, Visco, because you can edit right on your phone. So for people, it feels like they're editing in the camera because they're doing everything on their phone. So that might be that might be an argument for the success of some of those apps and why some of them were more successful than others. But another interesting argument is how that kind of comes into law and legal evidence. Because more often than not, when we hear about a case that's really a big case, or a criminal case coming to court, it's because there's video evidence produced of it before the trial starts, right? Someone pulled out a phone, started filming. That would have been very rare back not so long ago. In the days of handheld camcorders, you might be able to do this, but it would be difficult. And in fact, one of the most famous cases in American history came out from that very strange coincidence, which was Rodney King's speeding by LAPD police officers. And somebody happened to be on their balcony with a camcorder. I think it was a camcorder. It might have been, I forget what kind of phone it was. And actually, I recently read that it was sold in an auction, which I found to be a little bit creepy. I can't help but feel it's a little creepy, but whatever. And the first trial, They brought in the evidence and as the tape, and the prosecution said something like, the evidence speaks for itself. And then the defense did what, and you see they'll do this in every trial now that involves the police and something that's recorded. They all do this. Is they'll pause the video, they'll break it down into segments, cut it up, and have witnesses come in over and over and testify how each of these micro motions that happens in the video is authorized by the police code of conduct. And they were exonerated in the first trial. Oh yeah, that's no problem, Alan. Thanks for dropping by. I hope the dinner's good. So I think that kind of a thing really shows how different you can get, even with ostensibly the same evidence, the same tape. People are going to see a totally different action based on whether you speed it up, slow it down, cut it, how you describe and talk about different moments. It's going to change what that is. It's going to change. At first, it became evidence to condemn the police officers. It was damning evidence. Then it became the evidence that they used to get themselves off from the same evidence. Very weird. And if we have that documentary view of photography, I think less and less young people do, because they are so accustomed to being caught out by assuming that an image is real online and being like, oh, obviously it was photoshopped. That kind of hermeneutic of suspicion does follow images around today online more commonly. But aside from that, just that. I think that people are more suspicious because we see that photographic nature of an event doesn't tell the whole story. We need different angles. Because when we try to make evidentiary claims from images, those questions always come up. And this will happen with any kind of evidence, though. Anytime if you take a written document and you were able to look into its full context, you would see very quickly you don't have enough information. You never have enough information to get the whole picture. And this is something that's quite familiar to historians who are like, sure, I have all these documents, but who wrote them? Why were these the ones that were preserved? What did the other people have to say? And some of that stuff's not written down. You might be able to get to it or infer it in other ways, but it's just not written down. So we only ever really get a partial story when we're talking about these kinds of events that are broken apart by different viewpoints. That's pretty much every human event, in my opinion. So that's not to say that evidence doesn't matter or evidence is not real. It's not to say that everything is equally valid, every claim is equally valid. That's not what I believe. I think that's pretty easy to show is a quite absurd claim. But that doesn't mean that any one piece of evidence can't be qualified by another one in almost every case. That evidence can never tell you the whole story. It might tell you enough of the story that you come to a judgment that you feel comfortable about. That's kind of all I hope for. I'm kind of like, I'm pretty comfortable after seeing that, of thinking this. But I try to remain open to the possibility that something else could come up that could change my mind, even if it doesn't. Less worried about the details and more about the gist. Yeah, I like that. Though sometimes I think that it's interesting to kind of try to treat the details as the gist. Sometimes when we kind of take a detail and be like, well, what if the detail is really the thing that really was meant here? Because I like the idea of the gist or the pith of things, being like, what's really the essence? And we have to we're doing that all the time. Just with sensory processing, even the world that seems immediately before us, we're really only getting the gist of it. And you can prove that pretty quickly by showing where your blind spot is. You do the little experiment like, oh wait, my mind's just kind of filling stuff in. Most of the stuff's blurry. I'm actually getting very little of what I'm hearing. Do I even know what I'm sensing? I'm not paying attention to most of the things that I'm immediately sensing even. So we're constantly editing. It's not just that editing is the essence of reality. Editing is essence. Everything's edited, cut up. Everything's a gist. But one thing I sometimes get nervous about when people are like, well, just give me the gist of things, is that the gist can sometimes become a kind of lowest common denominator meaning. It's the most common, the most average meaning. But that itself is an orientation, that the most average meaning, the most typical meaning would be the kind of gist of something. Sometimes I like to think that the gist of things is what differentiates them from other things. So if you told me the gist of you and you were like, well, I'm an engineer. Is that the gist of you? Actually, maybe I need a detail to get the gist of you. I need something that kind of differentiates you from others. Because I know something about you if I know what you do for a living, but most of the time, that's not going to tell me too much. Yeah. Well, it might not be your conscious intent, but who's not to say it's something's intent? It might be the intent of an evolutionary process that's like, whoa, this is too much. This is too much. We got to cut this down or we won't survive. And you might say, look, you're just playing with words there. That's not what intent means. But good luck with that one, trying to find a way to talk about intent. I mean, you're going to be deep in the metaphysical woods if you try to say, well, no, there's a clear difference between ascriptions of intent to these kinds of impersonal agencies like evolution, the descriptions of intent to human agents. I don't know. It's not. So I've tried to draw a line there, but I've thought a lot about it, and it's not too easy for me. So if you find a way, let me know. I think we're always kind of giving intent to things, and we don't even always realize it. Your car doesn't start, and you kind of kick it. And you don't think it's alive. You don't think the car did it, but we kind of act that way anyway. Oh yeah, I just pick evolution randomly because there are lots of different perspectives. And usually I don't go to evolution because a lot of times people go to evolution to do exactly the thing that I'm warning against, which is kind of reduce everything. Be like, oh yeah. Why do we like to look at our screens? Because we remember the ancestral fire. It's like, maybe there's an easier explanation. Just we like what's on the screens. We like the feeling of being near people. Like, evolution isn't like the thing that has to explain everything, is it? That would be kind of weird to expect that. But a lot of people do. They're like, now it's satisfying. The other explanation of like, I wanted to be distracted because my life kind of was boring or sucks. That wasn't a satisfying explanation of why I'm always distracted. But now if I have this ancestral memory, that's satisfying. I don't know. They both kind of seem unsatisfying to me as explanations. %, drop frames. Not dropping frames this time, folks. How about that? Yeah. What did you get for dinner, Alan? Chicken and rice. K. I was going to say chicken adobo, but chicken and rice is so common in lots of different cuisines. I don't know. It could be in a lot of different things. But yeah, that sounds good. Sounds good. I remember one time someone told me that speaking of like, why do we look into our screens and it's this ancestral fire. A funny version of people just kind of wanting to be together through some kind of media was told to me once by someone who worked in, I think it was Tamil Nadu. It was a Tamil speaking part of India. And she said that there was a radio call-in show every day around the time of lunchtime. And pretty much everybody in that area all had the same lunch, which is something, rice and something. I forget what the other ingredient was. But this is kind of a staple dish that pretty much everybody, and it's a relatively poor area, so there wasn't going to be a lot of variety in that kind of midday meal. But the radio show was, what are you eating? So people would just call in one after the next, all saying that they were eating this one dish that they were all eating. She said it was very popular. It was very popular. I wish I could remember more of this. Speaking of the details, I would like to remember the details of that story. I probably could email her and she would tell me, but I would be embarrassed to be like, of all the things you told me, this one weird anecdote's what I wanted to remember from you. But she'd probably be pleased. So maybe I should. But anyway, and I think her kind of hypothesis about it, which seems right to me, is that represents a kind of function of communication that we all understand and want, but we tend to downplay when we're thinking about communication, which is like just the sense of other people's presence. How many of you fall asleep to Twitch? How many of you fall asleep to YouTube videos or podcasts? Yeah, that would be an even weirder thing to explain. Okay, so first, I'm going back to someone I haven't talked to in years, and then I need to tell them about Twitch. I think I just asked them this story. They'd probably be fine. Actually, there's a lot of things I want to know from them, so I put in a list of questions. But yeah, I like that. I like that story because it shows the kind of that it's not really about the content, the so-called content of the message a lot of the time, because you kind of know what everyone's going to say. That becomes its own content of being like, yeah, we're all eating the same thing, you know. But it's if it's happening weekly or daily and it's always the same thing, it's not going to be interesting for that reason. It's just you're hearing the quality of people's voices and the fact that other people are there doing the same thing. Yeah, exactly. I think that probably most of the content that people are consuming is happening in this kind of environment of half distraction. And I find that to be very interesting. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. And it helps inform my my sense of what kind of public speaking we should practice. And even though I kind of like the oratorical mode, which is a really outmoded form, and I've tried it a little bit recently myself. Oh my gosh, my nose is so itchy. I need to go take a pill or something to get rid of this itchiness. But anyway, I'm just going to keep itching it grossly the whole time. So the oratorical style, I don't think works very well with it. These highly composed structures of thought that you're going to put into a very clear kind of order, that kind of a thing. I mean, who listens to that anymore? I think it's worth practicing, but it's not where we're at. So it's one of the reasons why I adopted Twitch, which is how would I try to do the stuff that I'm doing in a format where people are coming in and out, I can't see them? I think that's very interesting to me. It's very exciting. And I know that as a streamer, you know this too. I sometimes pop in on your stream too, and I kind of see what you're doing, so I get some tips from you. I know another streamer who usually has 50, 75 folks in the stream, but only 5 to 10 participate in chat. Yeah, exactly. And they might be very closely listening and just not participating. You never know, which is another one of the weird elements about this kind of discourse. This modality. People just can choose their own adventure, insofar as that adventure is one of the options given to them by the platform. And in this one, it's pretty limited. But I think it's good. Having a bunch of different kinds of modes of communication, different rules and norms that come with the platform, makes me sometimes wonder, and as someone who has no software engineering abilities, I can't really do more than wildly ponder on these things, but you probably could do this in a more interesting way, which would be, what would be a kind of platform that you could create to produce a certain kind of effect? Let's say we wanted people to really come out. We were good at producing anger, and we're good at producing kind of envy, I think. I think these are the two feelings that social media is best at producing, anger and envy. What if we wanted to produce another feeling that people get when they're on social media? There are lots of other ones on there. They're probably all on there at some point. Pity, admiration, all these feelings you see. You can see that on any Reddit front page, that kind of stuff. What about if you wanted people to come out and feel creative? What kind of platform, what would the platform design be? And you don't really know how people would engage with it. You can make some guesses, but maybe thinking at that kind of design level is another interesting path to think about. What kinds of discourse do we want to have? Because every time you're entering one of these social media environments, not only are you operating in the linguistic norms of a community that you might not really be familiar with, or you might be learning, or you might feel that you're the appointed spokesperson for, and then you learn quickly that actually the young people have moved past you, or whatever. These kinds of things that happen all the time. You're also operating under the kinds of more, even more sometimes subtle conditions of what the algorithmic rules or the just basic functionality of the platform, the GUI side of the platform, meaning the graphical user interface side of the platform, provides to you. Yeah, I should check out TikTok. I've seen it before. It's impossible not to see TikToks as independent entities that float through the experience of the app I haven't done partly because I know I would be quickly addicted to it. And also probably depressed. I have a pretty weird reaction to things online, as I know from living with someone else who watches things online, and she'll show me things and send me things, and my reactions are not what I'm supposed to have. I don't think a lot of the time. I have strong reactions, but not the right ones. You think? I think the people, we've been doing it pretty well. Most people get on Facebook and they come out feeling angry. Yeah, I mean, I know. I mean, I know that most people are going to experience it as getting it through the content, but I think that one of the things that maybe we underestimate, and why I'm posing it partly as a provocation, which is maybe it's not. Maybe McLuhan is right in a limited way, which is the medium is the message, or in this case, the platform is the message. That the platform kind of orients you in some basic ways, not to a specific emotion. That's kind of putting it in a dumb way. That's not the sharpest way to put it. But that the platform kind of orients you to think about your interactions in a way that is maybe not fully conscious to you. And I think if you use different kinds of... I've never understood the saying, the medium is the message. Yeah, that's Marshall McLuhan's slogan. I don't love McLuhan, and I know a lot of people who do. So I've talked about him a lot with people who I admire, and they think of interesting things in relationship to him. But if we take that idea for what... I mean, one of the things he was trying to say, and he really made his bones in a similar period to what I work on, which is the Renaissance, and he was thinking about print. And he wrote a book called The Gutenberg Galaxy. And he said lots of like really wild and unsubstantiated claims about things, but he had some good points, which is basically like when society changes to a society that's organized in some very important ways around print, out of a society that's an oral culture, obviously some things are going to really change. That in an oral culture, things that are valued might be, people who have long memories or who can sing a poem that kind of preserves that. And that might not be as valued in a print society. And so the kinds of discourse we're going to get has changed. And so then he applied that same insight to mass communication technologies, obviously the radio and television, and the internet wasn't around when he was first starting to write, but oh boy, lots written about that now. And the idea being that even in ways that maybe we're not fully conscious of, and in ways that require you to pay people like Marshall McLuhan to understand, because there are some consulting agencies that have tried to make a buck off these ideas. So we're going to teach you how to operate better in a social media environment, right? This stuff is still happening. They don't need Marshall McLuhan anyway now because there's just so much surplus money, so much surplus capital for people to be hiring lots of different kinds of consultancies. But the idea being that, okay, the kind of discourse is being shaped by where it's happening. And I think there's truth to that insight. There's truth in it because it's so broad that, like, how could it not be true? But it's still important to remind us of that because a lot of people still go back to what I was talking about before, which is the language as dictionary thesis about language, that language is kind of the same in all of its manifestations. Things always mean the same thing, and if they don't, it's because of error, or they don't because of a really long time ago people used to talk like Shakespeare or the Bible or something that people are familiar with. So those are ideas that I would call language ideologies that people have about language, that their language is better than other people's language. Might be a version of language ideology, but it might be... I mean, the medium, that's, I think, one of the weakest parts of McLuhan is what he means by medium is, like, very hard to pin down. And I don't think that would be a problem if he didn't kind of constantly insist upon using that term. I don't like that term very much, the medium, right? It's the singular of media. So when we talk about the media, you might just kind of think about it that way. That maybe makes it too confused with the content, but he's like, well, think about what kind of media you consume. Is it a newspaper or is it from YouTube? And you might say, oh, okay, no. Well, there's just different kinds of arguments happening on YouTube than on newspapers. Like, but don't you think that maybe the way that the material and social conditions for the productions of newspapers create a different kind of discourse than the material and social conditions of producing YouTube videos? And I would say, obviously they do. For one thing, newspapers tend to have editors. But that's a social condition, right? That's a social condition that based on how it's produced, because it needs to be produced in large quantities to be profitable, that kind of thing. But also the material conditions that you read it, you read it in a column. He got really into the details of the physical parts of the technology and how that would change the ideas. So it was an argument in some ways. It's kind of a materialistic argument, you could say, in some versions of what he did. But not like Marxist materialism, more like media materialism. It's kind of a weird idea. It didn't really work totally, in my estimation, but it did give out some good insights. It wasn't the kind of final discourse, truth of everything science that some people wanted it to be. Like cybernetics maybe also wanted to be in its own time. It's a constraint of the media. I can totally get behind that, but I still don't get the message part, because if you own a press, you can print any message you want. Yeah, I hear you. I think that idea is much more common today, because people are like, well, look at the internet. People could put websites up about anything. And I think one of the things that I tend to agree with critics of McLuhan on is that he overemphasizes that kind of physical aspect of the medium, because the what people can say can vary quite a lot. But I think one of the things that we might help us to understand what he was getting at, which is that it's not just that an individual can produce any message that they want, which is that the kind of individuals that we get and the kinds of thoughts that we get come from a society that has those technologies or has those media. So already the ideas that you have are already being shaped by those technologies in ways that you might not be fully aware of. And I think that's the big idea for McLuhan, or one of his big ideas. What would that look like? It's hard to say, right? Because we're living in it. It's hard to say for the internet. It's easier to say for something that's already happened, because you can look at it as a distant past and say, oh, okay, it looked like this. So one of the funny things is, but that's not at all the idea I get from the phrase. Oh, yeah, exactly. Well, it's a terrible slogan, because if the point of a slogan is information, but it's a great slogan if what it's supposed to do is produce a question. What do you mean by that? And I think that he kind of knew that. He also changed it at one point to the medium is the massage, which is even more cryptic. And I think that's what he was trying to do, which he was trying to say, he's like, in the kind of media environment we're in now, and I want to disseminate my ideas in a way that's going to reach the widest possible audience, the best thing to do is to have a really short message that people need to ask a question about. And I'll get lots of interviews. And he did. He became very popular. He even appeared in a Woody Allen movie, because he became such a kind of popular talking point. Mostly because I think people didn't understand him, and there was a lot of pseudo-intellectuals trying to kind of make broad pronouncements about his ideas. But say that again? Oh, man. So here's a medium problem. That's not time-stamped, nor do I remember what I just said. So I'm in an oral modality, and you're in a written modality. So if we were in the modality where I was responding in time to all of that, but short message with the question on it. Yeah, I sometimes do this. This is a thing that I do pretty often. Well, I'll ask people to introduce themselves for different goals. This just takes it back to traditional rhetoric, really. But you could say, well, what's the purpose of introducing yourself? From an informational point of view, you could say, well, the purpose of introducing myself is to let people know who I am. That's true. But usually there's other things that we want. We might say, I want people to kind of see me in a certain light. So one thing you might want to do is, I want people to ask me questions, so they kind of they feel, I want them to get me to offer the knowledge, right? If I put it all out there, it might seem like I might give them knowledge that they're not interested in about me, or it might seem that I'm kind of conceited. So I want to give the kind of thing that's going to make them participate in knowing me. Same thing with ideas. So the slogan has lots of different effects, but slogans are short, often because they're part of oral culture. And this is one of McLuhan's ideas, is that we become a global village. With the new technologies, we'll all kind of return to a secondary orality, was one of his ideas. Secondary orality. So the idea of a slogan, participating in that, I think that's one of the best proofs of his ideas, which is that was the idea of his that really survives. People still hear that and they don't know where it came from. So it kind of, in a weird way, proves his thesis, or it gives some evidence to support his idea that a secondary orality developed around mass media, And that means that people needed to kind of change how they were talking. You know, if academics or people who were in a more print modality wanted to have an effect in this other part of the media ecosystem, they needed to adopt the kinds of messages that were going to circulate. Suggestion from the peanut gallery of one for this type of thing is that I don't really know what questions to ask, or like the full universe of possible questions is paralyzing. Would have if you had a topic or something that bounds it and lets me bounce off? Or yeah, I kind of like the idea of bringing anything. But I hear what you're saying. It's kind of like, the moment when you're asked, like, well, ask me anything. People are like, and they kind of go blank. But I like the idea of keeping it open because I don't really want it to be a theme for this particular format. I want the chat, but you know, I hear you. I have very particular reasons about that, but I do like suggestions. I'll take suggestions. Well, here's the thing. We're like, well, what we're doing now, but we wouldn't have gotten there if we were already talking. But that's exactly the point, which is like you bring the thing and we talk. So yeah. So again, I'm cluing this right now. Just yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess what I adopted. This is the first time I'm doing this. The first thing I did was that when it kind of people had lots of stuff, and then a troll came in, and I got really nervous because I wasn't able to respond to the troll correctly because I was trying to find the buttons. So I think I had like a bunch of people come in, and then a bunch of people left because they were like, "Oh, this guy is not saying anything." So that was an unfortunate way to start with. But I do. I mean, I think that there is a way that I suggest things to people without giving them themes. There are other modes of suggestion other than saying, try this. That's kind of very direct. There are other kinds of suggestions. So I say, give me an argument. I'll give you kinds of characterizations of art. Give me an argument that, you know, you've been thinking about a lot, or one that comes up in your life a lot, or one that you would like to be able to get out of, or one that would help you. So I'll give characterizations of kinds of arguments when I do this kind of a thing. But I don't try to give people a theme because that makes it seem one less interesting to people. Because like, oh, well, I'm not interested in the theme, they're out. But also that ethic for this particular thing, the ethic of openness about theme, is really the content of what my argument is, which is there are ideas about argument that can be helpful to you regardless of the theme, regardless of what we know about it. It doesn't mean that knowledge isn't going to be helpful, you know, the particular knowledge about it. But it's not going to be the only thing that we can talk about. We can begin from another basis, which is thinking about it as an argument rather than about as a piece of knowledge. So just to make clear what the ethic is. I think that's for me one of the ways I understand what the sophists were doing in ancient Greece. And I know you know Steve, and I don't love the sophists quite as much as he does. But one of the things I do like about part of the sophistic ethic was that thing of like, we can think about language in these ways and how it affects people without having to think about it in terms of its relationship to a discourse of knowledge. If you try to make something for everyone, you're making it for no one. Oh, wow, that's like a very sophistic argument. That's perfect. Yeah. So I would first say, if you just want to, I can just talk about the argument if you want and give you some ideas about it. But if there are things you're like, well, here's what I think is weak about it, and here's what I want to try to make it improve, you can tell me that too, and we can talk about that. But in the absence of that, I'll just tell you some things I think about this argument, which is I've come across in a number of places that surprised me. And in one of them, a person that I really respect, who's dead, I don't know why I needed to include that, but he said something like, you know, genuine art is never made for an audience. And I was like, I don't like that idea. Because no, you should think about your audience. But I think what helped me better assimilate that idea that I wanted to respect because the person I respected and his thought I respected was something like a genuine work of art will create its own taste. And so you kind of have to speak to no one first before you speak to everyone. You have to kind of create what you hope the audience would be. So I think for me that's one of the stronger versions of like not just that if you make something for everyone you're making it for no one, is that you actually should make it for no one first. Make it for your own sensibility, and the audience will follow. And there's something about Twitch that makes me feel like that's a little bit true sometimes, right? There's some weird stuff out here. People find their own audiences. But not just in the sense of, oh, yeah, different strokes for different folks, but in the sense of really originality, in that an often abused idea. Originality comes from maybe not trying to appeal so much, but having another principle or an ethic that might be appealing to people who actually see it expressed. It's hard to value something before it's expressed. So express first, and then we'll find what the values are. I'd say the artist is definitely making it for themselves, which is definitely not no one. Yeah. I mean, there's also a long tradition where the artist is definitely make it for someone, which is their patron. And I think maybe most art, even today, most art is being made for somebody other than the artist in terms of that. But we did develop, especially in the European tradition, a kind of allergy to the idea of the artist being influenced by other social factors. But that was a late development, and a lot of stuff had to happen first. Really, until like what really got set off was this. Well, there was lots of stories you could tell her, but one version of the story is Le Salon des Réfugiés that Edward Manet put together, because the salon of the Academy, the French Academy of Painting. The French Academy of Painting also made a big thing, because when it was established by Louis XIII, I don't know, one of the kings, it was setting painting away from the other arts and crafts, the guild system. And it was like, no, these people are academicians. Because before those, all the painters were making it, all the sculptors were making stuff as part of, they were like builders. You'd hire everyone, all of them, to build a cathedral, and they would do the little sculptures, and other people would put the rocks on top of each other and carve it. It was all skilled labor. But then the Academy set up these people who are going to decide what good art is. And then all the people that got refused, they created their own salon. And this was a big, big show. This is where a lot of people feel like a certain kind of modern painting was discovered, because it was all this stuff that was maybe even taboo or shocking and was in this weird style. And I think that idea of valuing that idea of the artist, it's kind of creating for an audience that doesn't exist, also shows the effect of that, which is if you go to almost any museum today, like the most standard stuff that would be in the museums would be the Impressionists. These are the people that we're talking about, who were the refused ones. They created their own taste, right? So that's an idea, which is create your own taste. But I think if we're gonna, what's a good argument against this? I'm sure we can come up with better ones. These are just the first that come to mind. Which, if you create something for everyone, you're making it for no one. One thing you might say to that is, we could argue it from the point of view of like, well, we don't think the claim is true, so let's first do that. For most deformations, pure art, I don't think it exists, yeah. L'art pour l'art, there's a reason why we still say that in French. Similar, this was happening at the same time, also in literature and in painting, and a lot of it is happening in Paris, where people were like, look, it's kind of like when Dylan went electric. Like, look, don't look to me to be your leader of your social revolution or whatever. I mean, there are just as many artists that are very happy, and for all different political persuasions, to be seen in that way. Yeah. So artists disagree about this. And this is a question that continues in a different way and with like different examples today. People sometimes are like, oh, can I still listen to Michael Jackson? I don't like what he did as a person. Those kinds of questions I think are, to me, less interesting, but variations of the same question of how should we understand the relationship of the artwork to the artist. Did we have that conversation? Oh, that's cool. It's a good example. It comes up a lot. I save up these good examples because these argument themes come up a lot. But let's say we wanted to argue that no, if you make something for everyone, you don't make it for no one. What are some other alternatives? Well, you make it for everyone, you make it for everyone. That's one. But you can also say, well, you make it for everyone, you make it for some subsection of people who want to understand themselves as everyone. What you're really creating when you create something for everyone is an ideal or a standard of universality. And we could know very well, we could be quite conscious that the empirical universality of people, what they believe, what they think, how they're oriented, will never be unified. But we nevertheless might hold out as a kind of argument or an example in creating something for everyone. that this is the way that we should aspire to all be. Something like that. That might sound a little preachy, and maybe it is. Yeah, you hear it in a corporate environment, right? Exactly. And I think in the corporate environment, a lot of times when people are like, there's this new idea of like, we want to get quickly to the pivot. We want to quickly get to the pivot so that we're not writing tons of code for a problem that's really a marketing problem. We don't want to waste the time doing that. And I think they're kind of trying to specify what your market is and those kinds of questions. It's funny that the same idea that comes up in a very different environment about art, where I think it probably originated, but who knows? But I don't think it originated in the corporate environment. It's funny that kind of argument comes up there too, into the place that the same literal claims can be used. I think that's pretty unique. So we might say in the corporate environment something like, well, maybe producing something for everyone doesn't mean something that appeals to every single person. Maybe what we mean by that is it's a question of accessibility. And this is, for example, in video game design, there's been a lot of people that have noted how many of the accessibility features in games have also led to the adoption of those features by players that don't have disabilities, but just find them to be better. They've also led to innovative design in every aspect of video games. So that accessibility and creating for everyone in that sense is a creative principle of thinking about, well, how could we make this game accessible for everyone is a kind of creative challenge that you put before yourself. Yeah, exactly. No, I like the connections. Make the connections. Those are good. Yeah, if you don't go after a specific audience, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a failure product. I think that's probably true. Especially in the sense of, I think especially in the idea of marketing something, I think probably no marketing class in the world will be like, don't really think too much about who you're marketing it to. It doesn't really matter. And it's funny that when we teach the kind of stuff that I'm teaching, we're talking about writing, people are like, know your audience. People are like, what are you talking about? It's so mystical. But it is different because we're not doing marketing research when we're writing, usually. But I'd like to say the games are very still targeted at specific audiences. Yeah. I guess I'm saying we can interpret that argument to mean different things. Well, what would it mean to make for everyone? It doesn't necessarily mean to make it to everyone in the sense of appealing to everyone. It just means making it accessible to everyone. Those would be different ways of making for everyone. So that would be a definitional kind of riff on the argument. But you might say, okay, that's just not what I meant. Sure, that's fine. You'd say, no. Really what this means is making something that tries to appeal to everyone. We can't do that. But yeah, I gave what I think is my best version of how to defend that claim of being like, no, it's not thinking that everyone will adopt it. It's thinking that you might, for some reason, whatever it is, put forward an image of universality that you think is good. You say, this is what ought to appeal to people, even though we know that it won't. And that might not be something, uh-oh. Did I go away? Or is that just the computer? Oh, no. Oh, wait, am I back? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Actually, I wonder what that was, because I didn't look at OBS doesn't say any dropped frames, so cool. Okay. Yeah, exactly. I've been hacked. Well, I was earlier. I don't want to think about that. That was pretty bad. It was one of my worst experiences I've had on Twitch. Actually, it was by far the worst experience I've had on Twitch. And I hope it doesn't have future consequences and most people just didn't see it happen. But, oh well. You live and you learn. Okay, what were we talking about? Accessibility. And so games are targeted at specific audiences. But every time some innovation comes out, right? People are like, they just try something out that people like. That can be a moment where we'd say, look, you shouldn't make it for everyone because if you made it for everyone, you wouldn't make this innovative thing. But by the same token, if you always make it for a specific audience and you're just kind of following the current model that Hollywood producers have of saying, oh, well, let's do Toy Story 6. Let's do Fast and the Furious 11 because we know people will like it and buy it. That, maybe that's not what we want to do. Maybe that's not the ethic we're going for. And that producing it not for everyone. Sure, but you can also fall into a trap of producing it for a very particular vision of someone. So maybe producing it for everyone could be a way out of that. I'm just trying to think of arguments for why you might defend that claim. I think you saw one of those car vlogs I did. I've got a bunch of talking about art and artists and wrestling with this stuff. I have to send them to you when I finally. Car vlogs. Are car vlogs the people talking in their cars, or are they like vlogs about car models? Because I feel like probably both of those exist in great abundance online, but I'm not sure. Oh, your car vlogs. Yeah. Right. Yeah, I sent one of them to my class when you were you responded to one of the videos, and I sent it to the class. I don't know if nobody said anything about it, but maybe they watched it. I'm not sure. They don't watch the videos I do either, so it's probably too much to expect. Yeah. Oh man, Marshall McLuhan car vlogs is pretty long. I like the long vlogs. These are definitely, once you get into, I'm approaching 2 hours here in this session, and if I put this on YouTube, I don't know if I will put this one on YouTube. Not sure. Maybe I will. Just gotta edit it a little bit. That you're kind of like, you're not going for full attention. You're not going for rapt attention. We talked about this before. Just because of the trolling in the beginning, I have to edit that out. Yeah. It would violate YouTube's terms of the agreement that we have because of what the troll did, even though I didn't do it. But I would be doing it if I posted it. So, interesting kind of shift of agency. If you quote someone, are you quoting someone if you leave their comment in a video that you do? The kind of weird things that are produced by our new media environment, new rhetorical questions. Anyway, if you're just coming to the stream, probably not, but if you are here and you haven't, I don't know when you came in, this is an argument doctor stream. This is a new format that I'm trying out, and the premise here is bring an argument, come to the potluck. Here's an argument you've been kicking around a while, you've been trying to make it, it's not been going well, or it has been going well, and you want to kind of show it off, look at your shiny new object and say, look, try me out. And we'll try to make it better. And that can happen in lots of different ways. Depends on what you want to do. I can argue against you, or I can just give you both sides of the argument, try to make my best argument for it, something like that. Lots of ways we can do it. I wouldn't ask, are you quoting? I'd ask, are you publishing? And the answer is very much is, yeah, you're publishing, exactly. And that question of, well, what are the responsibilities of a publisher? Same kind of set of problems. If you're publishing something, a troll, are you trolling? Weird things like that. Might need another beer, though. All right, I'll be back in a second. I'm going to go take an allergy pill, which hopefully will make my nose less itchy, and get another beer. 1 second. Be right back. Yep. I'm back. Okay. Arguments should we talk about? Well, they don't have to be questions. They can be arguments. We can make them better. Just think about a situation in which you feel like you're like, this is coming up a lot. I keep ending up in this argument. It's like a recurring dream. You ever have those recurring dreams? And then you feel like, I think the more often that the dream recurs, at least I feel this way, the more it feels like it's probably meaningful. I think all dreams are meaningful, but I start to pay attention to it more and say, I really kind of need to figure out what this dream is about, or it will keep coming forever. I feel like recurring arguments are kind of the same way. This argument keeps recurring. It's probably a sign that there's something really important about it in your life. And maybe it's worth spending some time on and trying to reflect on how to make it better, or get into that argument in a way so that you don't have to keep dreaming it over and over again. Oh, good. I think you were winning life, Alan. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe most people don't. Maybe when I say arguments, people feel like the argument, because we do say in English, having an argument. If you're having an argument, you're in conflict. But maybe think about it. What's an argument that I keep making? An argument I keep having to make. Maybe it's an email at work, or justifying what you do to your boss. Those are arguments. They might not be arguments that you're having where you're in open and obvious hostile conflict with someone. But I think most arguments are not like that. It's just a quirk of our language and reflects maybe an attitude that we have in English about argument, that it's kind of a pathological feature of discourse as opposed to a quite normal and common everyday occurrence. Yeah, isolation can make it hard to have any kind of communication, so I understand that. But unfortunately for me, when I'm in isolation, I still have arguments. I just have them with myself. And those are the really tough ones. When you can't get out of an argument. I can't even win an argument against myself. Oh my God. Respecifying what I do in my job. I think these are arguments that people are constantly making. It's weird that you, today, more often than not, you have to write your own job description. I've been literally tasked with that before. Like, write your own job description. Kind of weird. I don't think that was that common even a generation ago. It's become very common. And boss was just, sure, yeah, that's just going to go into a folder on somebody's hard drive somewhere. And it probably won't matter a whole lot. But maybe it will. I don't know. Maybe it will in your kind of work. The invoice will be able to be charged in a different way or something. But yeah, pretty weird. Obviously, there are going to be situations in which you don't get to write your own job description if you're in a collective bargaining agreement or something like that. But fewer people are in those today, too. So, yeah, it's just kind of like write your own job description. But I wonder what you thought about when you were writing that and whether you thought of any of it as an argument. Because you're making claims about your job. And sometimes you might be the only person that could verify or disprove those claims, which makes you wonder. But nevertheless, they're kind of claims, aren't they? For me, it's pretty tough because if people ask me to describe what I would do, I do often change that answer based on who I'm talking to and what I think their attitudes are. Probably my default answer is to say I teach public speaking. I think that answer is nice as just a kind of the quick, you're waiting at the bus stop, what do you do for a living? Because it's true. It is mostly what I do. And I think it helps more people talk to me. Because if I said, I'm a professor, a lot of people would be like, oh, they get intimidated or something, which is not at all what I want. I get that you use the term argument, but I think the term I use is pitch. Yeah, pitches are a genre of argument in my book, but the pitch is kind of, the pitch has a few features as an argument that make it distinct. One is that you're asking your audience to adopt this as a project, not just as an attitude. You're saying, look, you're going to have a deliverable. You say, I'm going to do this, or we can do this if you invest money or if you hire me or whatever it is. And then they make a decision. So it's, in some sense, one of the clearer moments of rhetorical persuasion, but it still has all these weird things in it, which are like, how do I talk about the thing that doesn't exist? These weird moments where we get into unusual thoughts, I think. Though we might kind of gloss over them really quickly and just be like, just build a slide deck. I just filled out the template. One of the things I recently got to see was I did some work for a firm, and at the end they were quite generous in showing me all the other pitches that I had won out against in doing that. And so that was very interesting because I saw how other people thought of that assignment. 'Cause she's like, we're always writing pitches in the dark. So I thought you'd think it was interesting to see what other people did. One of the interesting things was that I wrote it on a Word document. Talk about medium as the message. Someone else made just a slide deck. So they sent a slide deck as their proposal. And I don't think I would ever do that. But I also thought that was kind of interesting. That's probably just the habit that someone has from working in a certain kind of communicative context. But it also kind of communicates or indexes something about them, which is like, oh yeah, we're part of the corporate culture. Nothing about it felt weird to me, but Alan, if you come to this stream often enough, you'll start to get the theme that I try to make things seem weird that are not weird to people. That's kind of the whole thing that I'm doing. You've proven. So one of the theories of literature, even, which comes from the Russian, they have this great word for it, ostranение, which is something like making strange, that the function of literature should be making things that seem normal kind of abnormal and weird. Not like mystical, but just like make you pay attention to them. You stub your toe, you have to look down and find what it is. So literature is one big stub of the toe, except it's a stub of the soul. So stubbing your soul, I'm coming up with this right now. This is what I'm trying to do, which is not produce literature, but the same effect, which is to take you out of your ordinary habits of thinking about things, and then in reflecting on them, be like, wait, there's a lot more going on in my own thoughts, that I'm doing a lot more work than I feel when I'm making an argument, or when, any of these other things about rhetoric I talk about. Yeah, you might not feel the weirdness in the moment. When you're doing something that's very habitual and that you've done for a long time, you're kind of like, this is the opposite of weird. So that's why I like to reflect on those things and be like, well, what if we phrase it and frame it in a different way? Can we make it feel weird? Because from the weirdness, we can maybe get an insight about it. That's my faith. I don't know if that's always the case for everybody, but that's kind of a lot of what I operate on. Just trying to get people into that weird feeling, get myself into that weird feeling so I can get to a new insight about it. So for me, one of the weird things, the thing that I thought was perfectly normal was like write a proposal. It's like, okay, there's no question. I didn't think consciously to myself. I was like, okay, that just means writing a document with like bulleted numbers and points and full sentences. And then I looked at these other ones, and one of them was a PowerPoint slide. It was literally slides. And a lot of them were not full sentences. And I was like, oh, wow, I would never think that would not seem to me to be what a proposal is. But that wasn't that isn't like why they didn't go with them. She wasn't like, these are bad proposals. She's like, these are good proposals. They're just very different from what I did. So that was very interesting to me because I hadn't thought about, that wasn't the thing that I was thinking about. I was like, oh, what should I say? What should the theme of the content be? And a lot of what they ended up deciding on wasn't the stuff that I thought was important. I've got a weird RAR that's pretty well tuned for anything outside the ordinary, even if it's surrounded by the ordinary. Well, how do you make that distinction? Or how does your weird RAR, how does it make the distinction between the ordinary and what's outside the ordinary? Yeah, lots of speech therapy went into me being able to say weird RAR. 8-year-old Tim is very excited that I can say that word. Yeah, no, I got it. Yeah, weird RAR, weird radar. It's just very hard to say. I don't think it's going to catch on. Too hard to say. But yeah, tell me about your weird RAR, because that's kind of what I really like to hear about. I'm not going to use that phrase, but that thing that people do. How do they do that? Yeah, you could probably buy a domain with that. I feel like that's going to be wide open pasture for you. You could just hang out there. WeirdRAR.net. Yeah, some people like the idea of being attuned to that, and they kind of go to like a stock image version of the weird stuff, where they're like, oh, weird is like, that's being so zany and crazy, or like, ooh, I'm into ghosts and astrology and stuff. But maybe just because of how my constitution is, things just tend to seem weird to me. So I don't know if that means that it's a well-tuned one or one that's really off of tune. I think it's probably out of tune, but maybe that will help other people. It makes me feel like a lot of things are weird. Yeah. Yeah, some people have that feeling when they like walk into a room. They're like, they know if anybody's been in there, if anything's been moved. That kind of attention to detail is one kind of attention to detail. Another is like all the weird meanings of what could be said. Be like, oh, something's off in this relationship. Like, what's wrong with mom? Is she sick? She's speaking in a different way than usual. And I feel like, I wonder if those two people they probably could be the same person, but different kinds of sensitivities. People have different kinds of sensitivities, Interesting external, weird internal. Oh, I like that. Both of those terms have, I think, very interesting etymologies. Not that it really matters, but weird has a very clear etymology, and it comes from Shakespeare's Macbeth, where it has an earlier history, but that's where it gets its modern meaning. So weird means like the weird sisters in Macbeth, and it has a etymological idea of being able to see the future. But it became a word that was used less often outside of that context, and then people made plates, in the 19th century with images of the weird sister, like the weird sisters, and you're like, oh, those are a little weird. So these people were just like, oh yeah, things that are like that, things that are like those creepy witches. Oh no. So that's where weird came from. Interesting. Oh, I'm a meds that change my perceptions a little. Colors look different. Oh, wow. That interesting instead of weird. Oh, for you, colors are external. Well, obviously, that's like a great classic debate topic. Are colors external or internal? Good arguments on both sides, I think. And on neither side. Or you could say both or neither. This is really one of those Nagarjuna type questions where we need a four-place logic to cover all of it. But yeah, it's interesting that you think that colors are outside of you. Hard to say. Especially since you're having kind of subjective effect of it on the basis of I mean subjective in the sense, not like subjective in the broadest sense of subjective. Yeah. Yeah, interesting. You have, this is a kind of loose, it doesn't quite mean this, but if you broke it down into its kind of literal inter essa in Latin, literally means to be between. Something that's between us. I like this idea of the interesting, which is, it's only interesting if it's between us. So interesting is a kind of principle of communicability. But we tend to think about it's interesting to me. I think today interesting is a judgment that kind of postpones something. Like, oh, that's interesting, but maybe I'll get to it later. So, yeah, it's interesting as kind of, oh, that's worthy of consideration at another time for a lot of people. Yeah, it's all in my head, but since that's all I know, yeah. I don't think it's all in your head, to be honest, but that's what a lot of people mean when they say subjective, is just like, it's just the absence of objectivity, which for them means certain and knowledgeable and that kind of stuff. And I think my own orientation is that is a deep-seated source of a lot of our problems, is that people don't have any way of valuing the subjective. So even here's a weird argument that I'll give you. Now I'm bringing arguments. You can help me make it better. One of the reasons I think that there's been lots of attention to mental illness. Some of that I think comes from real events that are out in the world, and because people are having a kind of richer sense of what mental illness might mean and a better education about it. And it might be that there's a higher incidence of it. Hard to say. That one's a hard one to prove. I don't really have an opinion about that. But one of the reasons why I think that in some quarters, it almost is kind of seen as like something desirable to present yourself as like having a mental illness, is because that's one of the few things left as a way of kind of characterizing your subjectivity. But it still has that kind of color of the objective, because people are like, no, it's a scientific diagnosis. And I wonder if we were just a little bit more comfortable with the subjective, like with subjectivity. Whether we couldn't have an even more creative way of identifying ourselves. We wouldn't need to rely upon like a manual as much. Not to say that discourse doesn't have value. It has a very clear value to insurance companies. But it doesn't have to be an all or nothing proposal. Be like, yeah, my diagnosis can help me in certain areas, but it might not be the only way I can understand myself too. It might not be the way I want to present myself, because I might have like my own kind of creative understanding of these things. Yeah, that's just a thought. Color is light of specific wavelengths, bouncing off things. My perception of it is different. Not. There's a way that folks into that by saying, for example, I'm ADHD or I'm bipolar. Yeah. Because it's like, well, that's something that has character. Like if you're a completely sane individual, first of all, I don't believe in that at all. So, or as like a variation of the old saying goes, if you're completely sane, something's really wrong with you. There's truth to that. But I think it's also like, well, what would that even mean? Like, who could identify with that position? If everything is just science, if that's the only discourse that has truth in it, what would it mean to just be a normal person? It would mean to be nothing. Because the only thing that's valuable is the objective. And objectively, you are a bag of meat. Mostly water. Right? That's not a very interesting thing to be. So having a condition is to have also the human condition, kind of return to it through the back door. So I have a lot of sympathy for why people do that, but I also think that sometimes you can kind of feel that people are trying to get recognition, not because they're like, people tend to see this in a really negative light, like, oh, people just want attention. Sure, people want attention. I want attention. I'm on Twitch. Well, everyone wants attention. But, well, not everybody. Well, most people want attention. But I think that sense of like being somebody, because of a strange turn in human affairs, that our discourses have really eliminated a lot of the value of the subjective and where that would have come from before. Like things that that being able to know something that's not scientific might be a way to show who you are, or to have a kind of clear practice. Now, the practice thing I think is returning too. But these are, these are things that people find desirable. One thing I would say in general, if you're trying to improve not just a specific argument, but you're trying to get more cachet with a certain audience that either you find yourself in opposition to, or maybe they're clients, could be in lots of different contexts. One thing that you can do to get like a lot more purchase on your arguments is to think about what they value that you don't. And try to think about, well, what would be the reason that someone would value that? And don't just kind of immediately dismiss it. This is, I think, the most generous thing you can do in just kind of imagining an audience, is thinking about why they have their values. It doesn't mean you have to share their values. It just means like, can I see why it would be desirable? Why would it be desirable for someone to like really love their country, where they're from? That might not be something that you value, but surely you can think of why that would be valuable to somebody. What would go along with that? Why it would be valuable. Or you might think, why would it be valuable for someone to really always try to be inclusive of all of these people who aren't actually here? Why would that be a value? I don't understand it. Well, maybe you could if you thought about it. What kinds of values that would involve? Rather than doing the cynical thing that we tend to do of saying, oh, well, you're patriotic just because you hate immigrants. Or you want to be really inclusive just because you're virtue signaling. We tend to reduce down the values of others to their paradiastolic opposite, the most negative neighbor we can find to their values. But really, people's values have a lot of content to them, historical content, that you could understand and then maybe have better relationships with. Because there might be something in that value that you can relate to. So say, okay, I'm not really a patriot of where you come from, but I love something that stands in the place of country for you, that for me, another thing stands in the place, which is an ideal. And I feel like I live there. Because you don't know everybody from your country. And I don't know everybody that I think shares my ideal. But we both share a community of people. And you could be in my community. Even though I can't be in yours because I'm not from your country or whatever. Or you might say, yeah, you really want to be inclusive of everybody and make sure that nobody's kind of left out. But I feel like sometimes when you do that, because I understand the desire of trying to speak to a large number of people, not step on anybody's toes. But another thing that we both value, I think, is being honest and clear. And if we're going to represent different people, we're going to represent different views. So being inclusive means being inclusive of not just all those views. Being inclusive doesn't mean being supportive of every view. That would be ridiculous. But giving them their time and place to express themselves in their own language. And then we can have a conversation afterwards about that language and what it means to bring it here. Something like that. Lots of different values. What's up, Alan? Welcome back. Yeah, I wonder if this will be a good format for Twitch. I think it might be better than the other ones I've been doing, though. I'll probably keep doing them. Okay, go ahead. This one's got a lot more viewers than usually, which I think is interesting. Pros and cons of bringing back Welcome Back, Cotter. Oh, man. Okay, you're going to have to tell me more about the show. I just know, like, the very basics of the show. But I could give you very generic ideas about the show, being like, okay, well, why would it be good in general to bring back an old TV show? I can give you lots of easy arguments for that. One would be because what's on TV now is really bad. Or we're remaking everything anyway. Why not remake something that had like some heart and spirit to it? We could do it though, I know it's just a meme, but we could do it if you want. But no, I don't really think that. I think that a lot of what's on right now is bad. Maybe I think I probably would even go so far as to say most of what's on right now is bad. But what I mean by that is, subjective. But also what's on right now. What do we mean by on? I mean, it's just available on streaming services for most people. Yeah, I do. I definitely include streaming services in TV. Especially since I'm someone who is one of those people that doesn't have cable. But I have a TV, so I feel like if I turn on YouTube on my TV, I'm watching TV. But I do have different feelings about it. Certain kinds of content feels more televisual, and some of it feels more internet. But it's more on a spectrum. Because obviously I know that all of it's being delivered to me on the internet, and that the kind of monitor I watch it on isn't really what's making the difference here. But the character of what I'm watching, some of it resembles more the stuff that was produced in the solely televisual era, or the stuff that kind of is associated with certain television networks, and some of it I associate more with internet production models. But there are definitely big areas where that is harder to distinguish, and where I'm like, no, this is just a third thing. This is neither that nor that. So when my girlfriend shows me like beauty YouTubers, I'm like, okay, that's internet culture. That's not TV. But it's not because it has like low production quality. Some of it's has great production quality, but it's just like all of its genre is about drama, or it's about tutorials, that kind of stuff, which is not very TV centric. It's all just content. Yeah, I mean that's I think a very interesting conversation is, should we call all this stuff just content? And there was a big hubbub about Martin Scorsese when he came out against calling all this stuff content. And I thought this was a pretty interesting argument, because it's one of those moments where we're very explicitly arguing about language, should we use this term or not? But not in the way that it tends to go online more often, which is like, should we use this term or not in terms of people's identities? Because those arguments are great, but I'm like, I think sometimes it's hard to think about what language is doing in moments when it's really tied in with these other deeply politicized issues about identity. Yeah. One of the things that's just interesting to think about is, why would Martin Scorsese say, like, well, films shouldn't be considered content? One of the things that helps show us is that language indexes lots of things. One of them is value. So if I call something cinema and I call it a movie, even at that level, we hear this is very obvious connotative difference where movies might include like an Adam Sandler movie. If I call it an Adam Sandler's cinematic universe, even, that's very ridiculous. But you know what I mean? An Adam Sandler film, it sounds like a little bit silly, even though, of course, it could be. In the dictionary view of language, it fits. But it doesn't seem quite right. So I think it's content has a bunch of different valuations to it, and it's interesting to think of why people would want those values or not. In one of my vlogs, I got to the idea that we should switch to calling it art. The ACV is totally a thing. The Adam Sandler cinematic, yeah, it definitely is. It definitely is. He's making a lot of money for his friends, I think, is the most respected principle in his universe. But yeah, if we can call it art, but I mean, the funny thing is that even art itself wasn't always a highly valued term. We were mentioning this a little bit before when we were talking about the painters and stuff. I can go into some really boring stuff about this, so I'll try to keep it at a limit. I'm like, oh yeah, let's rip. Let's talk about Martianus Capellanus, or all these very obscure elements of medieval European scholarship. But the ideas of the arts and the liberal arts came out of an idea about both in the Arab world and in the Latin writing world anyway, about certain kinds of pursuits, but included things like geometry, which today we wouldn't think about geometry as a liberal art. So obviously that's not exactly what we mean when we think about arts. Then there's the idea of the arts as like the fine arts, but even when the fine arts were first being kind of thought about, they included something like optics, which we think of as a science today, not arts. So there's a sense of like what art has meant has varied, not just in the sense of like, oh, Duchamp's La Fontaine, is it really a piece of art or not? But in a very, very basic way, if you look at the whole history of art and when people use that term or its equivalents in other languages, art is not always valued highly as a term. You know what to say? People would say, no, what I'm doing as a poet, what I'm doing isn't art. What I'm doing is inspired. I'm not relying upon artificial means to produce this. I'm getting this directly from the gods or from the muses or whatever, right? So the idea of an art as being artificial, sometimes that could be good. That was what's being valued. But that could also be posed against something that's kind of like, oh, it's coming right from my nature. It's not artificial, it's natural, what I'm doing. So there's lots of ways that gets valued differently. Yeah, content for me definitely feels like it comes from that attitude of helping sell things. This has a very commercial character to it of this is the content for the thing that we're really selling. Hard for me to kind of shake that meaning out of my head when I hear content. So, but at the same time, I feel like it does capture well all of the places in a day where all sorts of random things might kind of come across the transom, and it's all content, you know. And I think I was saying this before on another stream earlier, where that it's also kind of become the content of experience. And even though that's really not what people originally meant with the use of that term, I think it helps me get a kind of handle on something about what's happening, which is that our experience is something that we don't feel very active in. That the content of our experience gets provided to us. This is kind of like an entertainment subjectivity. Another place where even at the moment when you're kind of like enjoying your favorite things, you're not really fully a subject. You're just a kind of fan. You're part of a fandom. you're producing data about how to sell particular objects, particular services or goods to particular groups that you belong to. People who like Star Wars like certain kinds of merchandise, certain kinds of jeans, whatever, versus people who like anime or whatever. I don't know what people like. The other thing that I was thinking about is the idea that folks could talk about the art they are making instead of the content. Yeah, some people are doing that. Some people do that in a very kind of concerted way where they're very, very clear about saying, like, I'm not just a content maker, I'm an artist. Pay artists, pay local artists. And so there are people that are kind of politicizing in that sense. I wonder if that works, because I think a lot of times people don't value art very highly either. They might value art highly, like, oh, yeah, of course, the great masters, but you're just some kid from around the block. What makes you an artist? And then we get back to this very basic question about the foundational authority of art coming from where? Does it come from the tradition? Does it come from the product? Does it come from the audience? Yeah. What's the difference between the capital A art and lowercase a art? What's the difference? It's funny that these art arguments keep coming up. I wonder why that is. This is my recurring argument that I'm having. All this stuff about art and agency. Probably related to the fact that I'm always thinking about this book called Art and Agency that really shaped a lot of my thinking, even though I'm not like an artist per se. And the guy that wrote the book is an anthropologist, and I'm not in anthropology, but that book really shaped a lot of my thinking. It's a good book. It makes the best versions of these arguments that I've ever encountered. The book is called Art and Agency, and the guy who wrote it is named Alfred Gell, Gell. It's a little bit weird. And he wrote it like he was dying, and so he wrote it like to say it is on his deathbed maybe makes it a little bit dramatic, but he did kind of write it with the knowledge that he was dying and as his kind of final summary of his thought. So it has an interesting character in that way. It still can be pretty technical. He did a lot of his anthropological field work. So it includes a lot of anthropological material or ethnographic material, but it also sometimes becomes like even breezy, and he uses lots of examples from history of art in all times and places. So it's got a lot of breadth to it, but it can be a little bit hairy in some of the parts until you figure out the kinds of terms that he's using, what he's trying to do with them. It takes a while to get into. Oh yeah, I would not pay $80 for it. I would probably just I could just send you a PDF if you really want to look at it. But yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things that I like about that book, really, other than all the weird examples that he has, and he's got tons of weird examples, is that for him, he's looking at anthropological ethnography. And you probably don't need to know too much about anthropology to know that a lot of it happened, in light of or as part of colonization, and even earlier in the period of exploration. And it has lots of troubling themes and ways of characterizing indigenous practices. So yeah, racism would be putting it mildly, in some of these cases. At the same time, anthropologists don't want to say, okay, there's nothing valuable. This material might be valuable in that it still recorded something, just like any piece of history, So not to take an ethnographic report as science, but just to take it as a kind of another anthropological artifact, along with all the other ones. So it's a complicated position to be an anthropologist, and I respect a lot what they do, not what all of them do, but what they try to do in kind of reforming a discipline or way of thinking out of a kind of radical critique of their own discipline. I think that has left anthropology in a very interesting place. As content, well, here's why content might be an argument, but couldn't be the whole one for him. So he says that there are like 4 basic positions in an art relationship, which is the artwork, the artist, the we'll call it the kind of patron or the audience. So that nexus of people, and then also the what does he call it? The subject of the work of art. So if someone who's a sitter for a portrait, them. Or if you're painting a landscape, the land. And so from his point of view, in all of these relationships, different societies take different understandings in different moments about what relationship is embedded within the work of art, which is always some kind of relationship of agency of one of those positions and a kind of patience of the other person. So you could say, if you think about the portrait artist, okay, well, what really is being reflected there? You might say, oh, well, it's like a photographic copy. It's really showing what that person looks like. And that's kind of giving agency to the sitter in the situation. Yeah, I can try to say them again. It's like the artwork itself. Yeah, the artist, the thing that's being painted, or the person that's being painted or sculpted, or it could be anything, So the thing that it's supposed to represent, you might say. Even in non-representation art, there still might be a kind of trace of that. He gets into that a little bit. It's kind of complicated. And then the patron, the person kind of paying for it, or the audience, so other people, society at large, or a group of people, or a particular person. So these are like 4 positions that he has for all these relationships of art. Yeah, the patron. But I mean, the patron could just be people looking at it, It depends on the context. So that's a kind of broad one. So like you could say that the patron is affecting the work because they're like paint that tree, and like okay, the painter does it, but you could say, well, really, what made that work was the person paying for it, right? So in this idea about art are all of these great arguments about agency and how agency gets represented and thought about differently. We all agree about the facts. The painter painted the tree, but we could say, okay, what really brought that painting about was the painter. The painter's the one that had the skill. He knew how to make the tree. We say, no, it's really the patron. She's the one that paid him to make it. Without her, he would have painted nothing or something else. You could say, no, it's really the tree. I mean, the painting wouldn't have looked the way it does unless that tree looked that way. Or you could say, no, ultimately, the reason the painting exists is for us. No, that's the wrong one. Or the artwork itself. No, it's like the artwork exists because we have a culture. This one would be harder to do in this particular example, but in some cases it's very clear. The artwork really exists because we exist in a culture in which artworks are valued or something like that. So he gives you like 8,000 examples of how all these different relationships appear in very strange ways, It's a very interesting book because that's a very, very simplified version of what he's talking about. But I like the book basically because beyond just art, it shows how all of those arguments about what agency is are always relative to ideas about relationships that people are having in other aspects of that society. So those arguments about agency are themselves kind of anthropological artifacts. So why couldn't it all be content? Because I think content is one of the arguments about what kind of agency it has, which is one of the reasons why Martin Scorsese gets upset about it. That he wants the artwork to have its kind of own agency. The film has an effect. It's not just content. It's not just produced for the patron or for the audience, right? And so for him, I think it reflects that kind of attitude where this is all just for the audience. And he's like, that's no good because I'm the artist. It's really about me, or it's really about the film. And so he wants to privilege another kind of agency that the film represents. I think that's what's happening. And that argument that appears to be about language or about terms is really this deeply embedded sense of relationships, social relationships between filmmakers, films, audiences, those who are producing it, etc. Yeah, I find it to be very helpful and surprising. All right, man. Thanks for dropping by. I'm not going to stay on too much longer. I might try to hit 3 hours just for kicks, but I don't know. I probably should have a schedule, but my life has not had a schedule for so long. It's hard to think about it, but I'll let you know. Or subscribe if you're not subscribed, and then you'll be let know no matter what. Or not subscribe, follow. I'm sorry, I'm using the wrong terms. See ya, Alan. Thanks. Nice. Yeah, and you, nice. Yeah, it's slowly building here. Not by any work that I'm putting in, because I'm not putting in very much work into this channel. But I would like to, at some point, become a little bit more serious about it. Not too much more, but just a little bit more. By having a regular schedule. That's what I'm hoping to do at some point. So yeah, any other arguments that you have that you want to talk about, let me know. This is an argument doctor stream. I am your rhetoric prof, and I'm here to help you make your arguments better. How do I do that, you might say? My argument's already great. I don't have any arguments. Why would I be in an argument? Arguments are bad. Well, when I say argument, I mean the kinds of ideas that you are trying to identify with, or the kinds of things you wish to express to other people. I really mean in a very general way. Just stuff you've been thinking about or working on or trying to work out in your life, or that you've seen in the news or in the media that you've been thinking about or that's troubled you, and bring it in here. And so that the argument, as long as it has a claim to it, we can talk about it. Even if we don't know everything that we might want to know about it, we can still kind of think about what makes it work as an argument or what doesn't make it work and try to make it better. Maybe help you in those areas of your life where that argument comes up. That is the premise. Will it see a season 2? I feel like that I've been pretty lucky so far this summer, because I've seen the tree pollen really aggressively piled up at certain parts, especially early in the summer. I haven't had too much allergy trouble, but for some reason tonight it's hitting me. Sorry about that. I even saw an argument recently. This was an argument that was moving around on different social media sites about pollen itself. They're being like, look, what really causes this pollen is not the trees, but urban planters. Because urban planters only plant male trees, so they have too much pollen, because they're not pollinating anything. And then there were different arguments about why people did this. One was that, well, they don't want the trees to fruit, the female trees to fruit, because then the fruit would be free, and they don't want people to have free fruit. And other people are like, no, it's not because the fruit is free. It's because the fruit will drop and spoil, and you'll have to clean it up. And then if you have to clean it up, you have to pay people, and this is a big problem for cities, and then if you live in an area with that, that'll be a big mess. And then other people came back and said, no, it wouldn't drop and fall because we could collect it and use it and distribute it for free. It's your idea of food spoiling that's free just comes from the fact that you live in a society that doesn't value this kind of thing. And so it was interesting because a lot of this argument kind of came out, started as an argument about the motivations for a genuine feature of, I don't know if this is true everywhere, but pretty much every city I've ever lived in, I think this is the case, where mostly male trees are planted, so that probably in light of that idea, for whatever different reason, what's the motivation for not wanting fruiting trees, to not have fruit trees? Is it because of desire to just make things simpler, or even does that desire get characterized as having a kind of social attitude that needs to be corrected? Interesting, I thought. Interesting. So even in these very mundane places of like, oh wow, there's a lot of pollen on my street, there might be a deep argument lurking there they wouldn't think about once we know, oh, I just thought that was natural. Well, nature is affected by us and by our decisions and what we do with it. So thinking of the natural as something that's necessary or unchangeable, probably none of us do that anymore because of all of our discourse about ecology and climate change, whatever we might think about it. Very few people are going to be of the opinion, well, nature is permanent. Nothing is changing ever. A lot of times people will take offense, like, no, it's natural. Don't change it. Doesn't mean that nature can't be changed. It means that it shouldn't be changed, whatever they think is natural. That's one of the very classical attitudes towards nature, the natural. Don't change it. And other people would be like, well, what's nature? Is corn natural? Well, didn't we genetically modify corn? Is that still natural? Is something natural only if it's untouched by human beings? And how do we know that it's untouched? What would be the kind of proof? What would we look at to make that determination? Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it might not be obvious. Sometimes there might be no way to tell the difference. Or you might also say, look, human beings, we live in the Anthropocene. Human beings affect everything in nature. We affect it all. So we can't assume that nature is separate from us at this point. I wonder what the rejoinder to that would be. I don't know enough, but I might say, like, oh, what about deep in the ocean? Surely we have had effects on the ocean, acidification, that kind of stuff, but is every ecological environment on Earth affected by human beings? Is it all equally affected by human beings? That'd be another kind of interesting line to pursue. Probably not in the argument that most people are trying to make when they're making those arguments, but, it's still there. Who knows what could come of it? All right. I don't think I'm going to make it 3 hours. This is great. Well, thanks for everyone who dropped by and who contributed some arguments or whatever you contributed. I appreciate that. I'll probably do this again. I'm not sure when. And I will now know how to block people more effectively on Discord. So I learned something very valuable. How to ban people. Haven't had to do that before. Which is really surprising given how extremely open I have been in lots of different areas. This is the first time I've had to ban somebody. And for an absolutely egregious abuse, So that's a little disappointing. But also, in light of that other context, maybe heartening. It's only the first time I've had to do it. And a lot of people deal with this stuff all the time. So, I leave this mostly feeling like this format could work better for Twitch than some of the other stuff I've done. And I hope that if you found this interesting, you'll let other people know and come back to twitch.tv/rhetoricprof, the Rhetoric Prof stream, where I am always trying out different things, but really all of the streams and all the different formats are designed to have us talk to each other and think about some of the insights that rhetoric provides us to live a better, if not easier, life. I will see you next time on the stream or on the YouTube channel if you're coming there. If you are on the YouTube channel, please do subscribe and you'll get more content that way. Speaking of content, later.